Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was a strange, unnerving feeling when I first realized that something wasn't right. But I didn't fully understand it until I turned around. The day had been long, and the evening had settled in with a peculiar heaviness. Like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't quite name. I had just finished a long day at the office, the kind of day that drained you not physically, but mentally, and all I wanted was to get home. The walk wasn't far, just a few blocks down the same quiet street I always took. The streetlights flickered on above, casting pale yellow pools of light on the sidewalk. The sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent evening. I passed the usual buildings, each one familiar, each one too well known to ever be strange to me. One building, though, was different today. It was the old brick office building just past the park, the one I'd passed 100 times before. It was an ugly building, honestly, with crumbling bricks, broken windows, and a general air of neglect. But today, as I walked past it, I couldn't help but feel an odd pull in my chest. Something about it was off. At first, I chalked it up to the fatigue, to the long hours that were beginning to wear on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like a sensation at the edge of my mind that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the shadows of the evening playing tricks on me. I turned the corner, heading toward the next block. But just before I could go any further, I glanced back at the building, and then I froze. The building was gone. I blinked once, twice, and looked again, but it was still gone. There was nothing there but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and tall grass, the ground uneven, as if the building had never existed. The space where it should have been was vacant, as if it had been erased from the street entirely. My heart skipped a beat. I walked back toward the lot, my feet heavy against the pavement, my mind racing. There was no sign of the office building. Nothing but the bare outline of where it should have been. The area was completely empty. The windows, the door, the faded sign with the name of the law firm, all gone. Nothing but space where the brick structure had stood only moments before. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, an overwhelming wave of unease rushing over me. This wasn't possible. Buildings didn't just vanish. It didn't make sense. I had been walking past that building just minutes ago. It had been there, standing tall as always, the peeling bricks visible even in the dim light. I stood there, for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty lot, trying to understand what had happened. The sound of distant traffic reached my ears, but the street itself felt too quiet, too still, as though the world had suddenly shifted and left me behind. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I had just been too tired, maybe I was seeing things. The street should be just as it always was. I opened the camera app and snapped a quick photo of the lot, hoping to make sense of the situation. But when I glanced at the photo, I felt my blood run cold. The picture showed the lot, empty as expected, but there was something else in the frame. In the background, partially obscured by the trees, was a faint outline of the building, the office building. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but unmistakably there. I checked the time on my phone. Only a few minutes had passed since I'd first noticed the building was gone, yet there it was, like a ghost in the photo. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. It was as though the building existed in two places at once, one in the present, empty and abandoned, and another in the past, barely a memory, like a faint imprint left behind by something that had long since disappeared. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to piece it together. The night felt colder now, the fog from earlier creeping in, thickening around the edges of my vision. I turned around again, my eyes still fixed on the empty lot, my thoughts swirling with confusion. And then, as I turned to leave, I heard something. A faint sound, a creak, a heavy thud, as if something large had shifted, like the weight of the building itself was being dragged across the ground. My heart skipped again, the blood rushing in my ears. I turned, half expecting to see the building reappear, to see it rising from the ground like some kind of illusion. But there was nothing. The lot was still empty, the ground just as it had been. I waited, breath held, listening for the sound again, but the street was silent once more. No creak, no thud. I backed away slowly, my feet moving of their own accord, my mind spinning. The whole night felt like a fever dream. Had I imagined the building entirely? Was it possible that I had walked down the street too many times and had just gotten so used to it that my mind had created a false memory? No, it wasn't like that. I knew what I had seen. I knew that building had been there, standing where it always had. I turned and walked home, my legs heavy, my steps unsteady, my mind still racing. Every few steps, I glanced back, half expecting to see the building rise up behind me, like it had never gone away. But nothing followed me. The street stayed empty, the lot still vacant. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked out the window of my apartment, trying to calm myself. The city was alive, the lights from other buildings flickering, the streets still busy, the usual hum of life in motion. But I couldn't stop thinking about the building, about the lot where it had been, about the shadow that lingered in the photo on my phone. I still haven't figured it out. Every time I walk by that spot now, I find myself hesitating, staring at the empty lot, waiting for the building to reappear. But it doesn't. It never has. And every time I think about it, I wonder. Asterisk, what if it was never really there to begin with? I had been wandering the streets for hours that evening, aimlessly walking without any real destination in mind. It had been a long, tiring week at work, and I was hoping a quiet walk would help clear my head. The city was bustling as usual. People walking briskly, cars honking in the distance. The low hum of conversations mixing with the occasional sound of footsteps. The weather was cool, with a slight chill in the air, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly baked bread. From a nearby bakery, it felt like an ordinary evening. I didn't notice her at first. I was walking down my usual route, not paying much attention to the street, when I happened to glance up at a small, inconspicuous store tucked between two larger, more modern buildings. It was a corner shop with an old-fashioned sign that read, "Antiques and Curiosities," the letters fading and weathered by time. The window was lined with dusty old objects, trinkets, knickknacks, and worn furniture that seemed to belong to another era. I had passed by it countless times before, but for some reason, something about it caught my eye tonight. And that's when I saw her. She was standing in the doorway of the shop, almost as if she had just stepped out from the shadows. Her appearance wasn't anything remarkable at first glance. A woman in her late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, and wearing a simple brown coat that seemed a little too old-fashioned for the modern world outside. But there was something about her that made me pause. Something about the way she stood there, staring directly at me with an unreadable expression. It was as though she was waiting for me to notice her. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward her. I found myself walking toward the shop without thinking, drawn by some unseen force. My heart had started to race, not out of fear, but something else, curiosity perhaps, or an unsettling sense that I was meant to go inside. As I approached, I saw her move slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if she were inviting me in. Without a word, she stepped into the store, disappearing from view. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. The door to the shop had been left ajar, just enough for me to slip through. The feeling in my chest grew stronger, the pull toward that store intensifying, and I stepped forward, almost without thinking. The door swung open easily, and the moment I stepped inside, I was hit by the musty smell of old wood and dust, mixed with a faint trace of lavender. The air was thick with the weight of forgotten memories, the kind that lingers in old things. The store was dimly lit, with soft, yellow lights hanging from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the shelves lined with strange, old objects. The faint click of my shoes against the wooden floor was the only sound I could hear. I looked around. There were old clocks, tarnished brass lanterns, worn leather books stacked haphazardly on shelves, and faded paintings hung crookedly on the walls. It was exactly the kind of place I would usually walk right past, but tonight it felt like I had stumbled into something different, something important. And then I noticed something else. The woman wasn't in the store anymore. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the aisles, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. But there was no sign of her. The shop seemed empty now. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though she had never been there at all, as though she had slipped away like a fleeting dream. I called out, my voice echoing in the silent room, "Hello." There was no answer. I took a few tentative steps further into the shop, moving deeper between the cluttered shelves. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest now, the unsettling feeling growing with each step I took. The atmosphere in the shop felt wrong, not dangerous but heavy, thick with an energy I couldn't quite place. I reached out to touch one of the shelves, my fingers brushing against a small wooden box, but when I looked down, I froze. The door, the one I had just walked through, was gone. It wasn't just closed, it was gone. The space where it had been, where the doorway had stood, was now just an empty wall, smooth and featureless, as if the door had never existed. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. What is happening? My heart was pounding now, the air around me suddenly too thick, too suffocating. I turned around, desperate to find another exit, but the shop seemed to stretch further than I remembered. The shelves were taller, the aisles narrower, and there were more objects. More strange items cluttering the space. I reached for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, I realized that there was no signal. The time on the clock read an hour later than it should have been. I looked back at the shelves, my eyes darting to every corner of the shop, trying to make sense of the confusion, when I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The woman was standing at the far end of the shop, facing away from me. She was staring at something on one of the shelves, her back to me, her figure almost swallowed by the darkness. I could see her dark coat, her stillness, but she didn't turn when I stepped forward. She didn't move. I wanted to speak, to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat. Something in me screamed to turn around, to leave, to run out of the store and never look back. But my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, as if I were being drawn toward her by some invisible force. I took a step closer, then another. The closer I got, the more I could feel something strange, something wrong in the air. The store felt colder now, the air thicker, and when I reached her, I froze. She wasn't standing in front of the shelf anymore. She was gone. But the shelves had changed. The items on them were different now. Not the same trinkets I had seen before, but things I couldn't recognize. Twisted, warped objects that seemed to flicker in and out of focus, as if they weren't truly there. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the shop seemed to twist and warp, like it was stretching, distorting into something that didn't belong in the world I knew. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as though it was closing in on me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder now, filling the silence. My breath was shallow as I stepped back, trying to find my bearings. That's when I saw it. The door, the one I had walked through, the one that had vanished. It was back. But this time, it wasn't just a door. It was an opening, a space that led somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't see. A dark void stretched. Beyond it, pulling at me, beckoning me forward. I stood there for a moment, the air thick with dread, the quiet, haunting silence pressing in from all sides. And then, without thinking, I stepped through. The moment I did, the world around me shifted again. I wasn't in the shop anymore. I was standing outside, but everything had changed. The street was empty, and the store I had just been in was gone. The familiar building was now just an abandoned lot, overgrown with weeds and cracked pavement. The air was different, heavier, and the feeling that I had crossed some invisible boundary settled in my chest, cold and unsettling. I turned around, half expecting to see the door, but there was nothing, just an empty street. I had no idea how I had gotten there. I didn't know what had happened inside that shop, but the unease that had settled in me remained. The woman, the shop, the door, they were gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a world that wasn't my own. The only thing I knew for sure was that the place I had just left, the shop, didn't exist anymore, and I couldn't get back. It wasn't supposed to be an unusual day. I had just finished work and was heading home like any other evening. The city's noise surrounded me, the familiar hum of traffic, the distant voices of people walking by, the clattering of a subway train passing beneath my feet. It was the usual rhythm of the day, the kind of noise that becomes a background, a constant companion you barely notice anymore. But that evening there was a subtle shift, a wrongness that seemed to pull at the edges of my perception, though I couldn't quite identify it. I was tired, the exhaustion from a long week weighing heavily on me, but I was ready to head home and unwind. The subway station was just a few blocks away, and as I entered the underground entrance, I felt a small comfort in the familiarity of it all. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a dull glow over the platform where a few other commuters waited, their faces tired, lost in their own thoughts. I stood there, waiting for my train, pulling out my phone to check the schedule. The subway system here is old. The stations are a maze of intertwining lines and connections that seem to stretch back decades, and I'd ridden it countless times. So I wasn't particularly paying attention when I pulled up the map on my phone to confirm my route. That's when I saw it. A station on the map that I didn't recognize. It was located on the same line I always take, somewhere between my usual stops, just a few stations before mine. The name didn't sound familiar at all. The map itself was outdated, a relic from another era, but that was part of the charm of the city's transit system. But this station, Elmstead Station, wasn't one I had ever seen before. I checked the name again, hoping it was just some glitch on the phone, some error. But no, it was clearly there. I stared at the screen, perplexed. I'd ridden the subway my entire life. I knew every stop, every turn the train made. How could I have missed this one? It didn't make sense. I zoomed in closer, focusing on the line that connected all the stations. The more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. Elmstead Station wasn't just unknown to me. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. According to the map, it was located at a point on the line where no station had ever been. I'd ridden this same route countless times, and I could have sworn I had never passed this station. The train arrived with a familiar screech, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced up at the signs above the platform, showing the usual destinations and stops. But as I scanned them, something else caught my eye. The signs were wrong. There, on the station list, was Elmstead Station, the same one I had just seen on the map. I blinked in confusion, unsure if I was seeing things, but there it was, right in front of me, listed among the other stops on the line. But that couldn't be right. I had ridden this line too many times to mistake it. Elmstead Station didn't exist. It couldn't have. It wasn't part of the schedule, not in any of the records I had ever seen. And yet, here it was, marked clearly on the list. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening. I climbed onto the train, unsure of what to think, but my eyes kept returning to the map on my phone. The station wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't real. But if it was, if I was wrong, why hadn't I noticed it before? The train started moving, and I settled into my seat, trying to push the thoughts away. The sound of the train clattering against the tracks filled the air, and the city outside blurred as we moved deeper into the underground tunnel. But the more I thought about Elmstead Station, the more unsettled I became. Something about it felt wrong, like it had somehow appeared out of thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading somewhere I shouldn't be. The train passed my usual stop, but I didn't get off. Instead, I found myself staring at the map above the doors, following the line further down. Elmstead Station was coming up. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an almost magnetic pull to see it for myself, to understand why it was there. Minutes passed, and I started to feel a strange heaviness in the air, like the train was moving slower, or maybe I was just imagining it. The tunnel around us seemed darker, more oppressive. I glanced around at the other passengers. None of them seemed concerned. None of them even looked up from their phones or books. It was like they were all part of some unspoken agreement, some shared illusion that everything was normal. But the moment the train pulled into the next station, my stomach dropped. It was Elmstead Station. The doors opened with a quiet hiss, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The platform was nearly empty, the lights overhead flickering softly, casting long shadows across the empty benches. It wasn't what I expected. It didn't look like the rest of the stations. The walls were old, cracked in places, and there was a musty, stale smell in the air, like this station hadn't seen visitors in years. The tiles on the platform were chipped, the tiles on the walls faded, and the overall sense of disrepair was overwhelming. I stepped off the train hesitantly, my feet moving against my will, as though something was guiding me forward. I felt like I had to get off, like I was being drawn here for a reason. But there was no one around, no station attendants, no commuters, just the lingering silence and the soft hum of the train pulling away behind me. I walked down the platform, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty space, and turned the corner toward the stairs that led to the street level. As I walked, I noticed something on the walls, an old map, yellowed and faded, of the subway system. It was mounted on the wall, but when I glanced at it, my blood ran cold. Elmstead Station was listed on the map. But the strange part was, the station wasn't listed where I expected it to be. It was in a place on the map where I knew there was no station. It was as though the map itself was wrong, as though it had been altered or edited. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. The more I looked at it, the more I realized that I couldn't remember the station being there. It was like it had always been there, but at the same time, it hadn't. I couldn't understand it. I turned and hurried back toward the platform. But when I reached the stairs to the street, I stopped again. Something wasn't right. I turned around one more time, and the platform was empty again. The map was gone. The station, the walls, the lights, they were all gone. The space in front of me was now just a tunnel, dark and empty, stretching ahead with no end. The walls had disappeared. The train had disappeared. Elmstead Station had vanished, like it had never been there at all. I stood there, staring into the darkness, unsure of what had just happened. My head was spinning, my body frozen in place. The moment I stepped onto the train back home, I glanced at my phone again, checking the subway map. Elmstead Station was gone. The map didn't show it anymore. The schedule didn't list it. The trains didn't stop there. The place, the station, the memory of it, all of it, had disappeared as if it had never existed. And I realized with a slow creeping horror that the station had only ever existed in the moment I had stepped into it. A place that existed for only a heartbeat. A station that wasn't meant to be there, that never had been. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, for some reason, it had been waiting for me. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind of night where the air felt like it was holding its breath. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and I was walking home from work, lost in my thoughts. The day had been long, the kind where everything seemed to drag on, and my mind was exhausted. I needed the peace of the walk home, the familiar streets that I knew like the back of my hand. As I walked, my feet unconsciously led me down the same route I took every day, through the quiet neighborhoods and past the same buildings. Nothing ever seemed different, except tonight. Tonight, There was something oddly unsettling about the streets, as though the city itself was holding on to some secret I wasn't allowed to know. I reached the corner where the cafe was, La Lumiere, an old coffee shop I'd passed by countless times. I'd never gone in. The sign above the door was old, the paint peeling, but it was still a well-known landmark in the neighborhood. It had always been closed by the time I walked past, and there was something comforting about that, knowing it was always just a part of the street's background. But tonight was different. As I reached the corner, I noticed her standing there. A woman, perhaps in her late 40s, with dark hair and a coat that looked a little out of place for the season. She was standing right in front of the cafe. Not looking at me directly, but pointing to the door. Her finger extended as if beckoning me to follow her gaze. Her eyes were distant, almost dreamy, like she wasn't really seeing me, or even the cafe, but something else entirely, something far away. I stopped, confused for a moment, watching her as she stood there. I thought I should say something, ask if she needed help, but before I could speak, she turned her head slightly toward me, her lips curling into a small smile. "It's a good place," she said softly, as if the words were meant only for me. "You should go inside." I looked at the cafe again, trying to understand why she was speaking as if I had never seen it before. She was still pointing, her finger unmoving, but the feeling that something wasn't right settled over me like a weight. I glanced at the sign above the door. It looked the same as it always had, but something felt off, like the world had shifted just enough for me to see it differently. I felt drawn to it, my feet carrying me closer, but then I realized something. The sign wasn't just faded, it was completely forgotten. I blinked, confusion bubbling up in my chest. The cafe's sign wasn't just old, it was wrong. In that moment, I noticed the street was quieter than usual. The usual hum of city life, the distant sound of traffic, the movement of people, was all gone. The street was still, the world suspended. I could feel the pull of the woman's gaze, and I glanced back at her, unsure of what to say. But before I could speak, she spoke again, her voice more distant now, almost a whisper. "It's been closed. For 20 years, you won't find it open again." I blinked at her, my mind racing. My thoughts scrambled. Asterisk closed for 20 years. That couldn't be right. I'd passed this cafe dozens of times. It had been open every time, the lights glowing inside, the small crowd of people gathered at tables. It wasn't even an unusual place, just a regular neighborhood coffee shop. I'd never once thought twice about it. I stepped closer to the door, my hand reaching out almost involuntarily. The air around me felt colder, and the closer I got to the entrance, the more I realized something was wrong. The window beside the door was fogged over, but I could make out the outline of tables inside, the same layout I had seen before, but everything was still. No movement, no customers. The lights were dim, almost completely dark. There was something frozen about it, like it was stuck in time. I reached the door, my fingers brushing against the cool glass, and for a moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch the handle. I glanced back at the woman, and her expression had changed. The smile was gone, replaced with something more wistful, as if she knew something I didn't. She gave a small nod, her hand lowering to her side. "I should have told you sooner," she said softly, her voice full of regret. "But you have to let things go." It's better that way. I didn't understand. I couldn't make sense of it. I reached for the door handle, the cool metal under my fingers, and I twisted it, pulling the door open. The instant I did, I was hit by the musty, stale air inside, thick with the smell of old coffee and dust. The interior looked like it had been abandoned for years. The tables were empty, chairs pushed to the side as if no one had sat there in ages. The walls were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the dim light hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I felt my heart stop for a moment as I stepped inside. This wasn't right. It was as if time had stopped inside this place, like I had stepped into a memory that wasn't mine. The shop was exactly the same as I remembered, and yet everything was different. I turned around, intending to leave, but the door was gone. The doorway had vanished behind me, leaving me in this strange, silent cafe, stuck between two worlds. The woman was gone, and I couldn't remember exactly when she had left. The only thing that remained was the quiet, empty room, filled with a stillness I couldn't explain. I backed away, my mind reeling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized the cafe had closed over 20 years ago. It had been abandoned. There were no signs of life, and yet here I was, standing inside it, as though it had never stopped existing. I couldn't escape. I couldn't leave. The door had vanished, and the room seemed to stretch on forever. A timeless space, frozen in place. And then, a voice echoed in the stillness, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't the woman's. It was something deeper, distant, almost mournful. "You were never meant to come back," it whispered. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned around and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the street, everything felt wrong again, out of place, like the world had shifted and left me behind. The cafe was gone, replaced by a dull stretch of empty sidewalk. And as I stood there, breathing heavily, I realized I had stepped into a place that existed between time, a place that had closed its doors long ago, but had somehow opened them for me. And now, no matter how many times I walk down that street, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched by a memory that doesn't belong to me, a memory that won't let me forget what I saw. I've always taken the same route home from work. It's nothing spectacular, just a simple walk down a quiet street that leads to a small park. The park isn't anything special either, just a few benches scattered beneath tall trees, a couple of pathways lined with old street lamps, and the occasional dog walker or jogger passing through. But it's peaceful, and after a long day at the office, the quiet always helps me unwind, clearing my mind before I get home. That night, as I walked through the park, everything felt just as usual. The sky was clear, the stars faintly visible through the canopy of trees, and the air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth from the recent rain. The park was empty, as it often was at this hour. I didn't expect to see anyone, but I always found it comforting, the silence of the place. I was almost halfway through the park when I passed by my usual bench, the one I sat on every evening, just for a minute or two, to take a breath and let the stillness settle around me. But tonight, something felt different. The bench was empty. No one was sitting there, but I couldn't shake the odd sensation that I wasn't alone. I stopped for a moment, feeling it. the presence of something or someone near me, even though I couldn't see anything unusual. It was then that I heard it. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable, a soft, rhythmic sound like a sigh. It was subtle, but it was there. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. Was someone sitting on the bench. I looked again, my eyes scanning the empty space, but there was no one there. The bench was exactly as it should be, untouched, no person sitting, no belongings left behind. And yet, I still heard it, a steady, slow breath. In the stillness of the park, it was unnerving. I stood there, my feet frozen to the path beneath me, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was causing something to move. Maybe it was the rustling of leaves. But the more I listened, the more certain I became. The sound wasn't from the trees, nor was it the wind. It was coming from the bench. I slowly walked closer, my footsteps soft against the damp earth. The air around me felt thicker now, the sounds of the park fading into the background as I neared the bench. The breathing, if you could call it that, continued. It was slow, almost deliberate. In, out. A deep exhale, followed by another quiet inhale. I stopped, just a few feet away from the bench, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Should I sit down? Should I leave? But my body felt rooted to the spot. My eyes darted around the area, looking for any signs of movement, any clue as to where the sound was coming from, but the bench remained empty. In that moment, I felt a coldness on the back of my neck. It was as if something unseen was standing behind me, just out of sight, waiting. I turned quickly, but the park was still empty. My breath quickened, and I couldn't help but glance at the bench again, my heart pounding in my chest. What was breathing? The breathing continued, steady, almost patient. It wasn't fast, it wasn't strained. It was the kind of breathing someone would make if they were waiting, calm, undisturbed. But there was no one sitting there. I felt the fear settle into my bones, crawling its way up my spine, and I couldn't bear it anymore. I stepped forward. My eyes locked on the bench, but I had to look away for a moment to steady my nerves. When I glanced back, I swore I saw something shift. For the briefest moment, the empty bench seemed to darken, as though something had passed across it. A shadow, maybe, but there was nothing there. The breathing continued, in, out. I reached the bench, trembling, and bent down slightly to get a closer look, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, something caused by the stress of the day, but there was nothing unusual, no signs of life. The bench was cold, wet from the rain earlier, and just as empty as it had been. But the sound of breathing, that stayed. I stood up again, my eyes scanning the park around me, trying to make sense of it. My breath was shallow now, my heart pounding in my chest, and I had the feeling that if I stayed any longer, something would happen. The air felt thicker, like the atmosphere itself was waiting for something to occur. I took one last, hesitant glance at the bench. The breathing was still there, but now, it felt closer. Too close. I turned and started walking, faster now. My steps quickening as I moved through the park, away from the bench, away from that awful, empty presence. I could still hear it. The slow, steady rhythm of the breathing. It was following me, or at least it felt that way. Each step I took seemed to bring the sound closer, more insistent, as though it was right behind me. When I finally reached the exit of the park, the breathing stopped. I turned once more, looking back into the darkness of the trees, but there was nothing there. No one, no sound. The park was still, as if nothing had ever happened. I quickly left, feeling a strange emptiness in my chest, like I had left something behind. But no matter how far I walk now, no matter how many times I pass by that park, I can still hear it, the breathing. It lingers in my mind, faint but constant, and every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll hear it again, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that, even though the bench is empty, someone is still there, waiting. The rain had been relentless all evening. I had just finished dinner at a small restaurant that overlooked the main street of the city, the kind of place that was a little too cozy, too quiet, where the only sounds were the clinking of plates and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I remember thinking, as I paid my bill, how strangely still everything felt. There was an odd calm in the air that evening, as if the whole city had paused for a moment. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool mist from the rain mixing with the warm city air. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting long distorted shadows across the wet pavement. The few people who were still out moved quickly, huddled under umbrellas or darting into buildings to avoid the soaking rain. I had no umbrella, no protection from the weather, and I didn't mind. I was used to the damp, used to the cold. I pulled up the collar of my jacket and walked towards the nearest corner to catch a taxi home. There was a small taxi stand just across the street from the restaurant, where a few cars were lined up, waiting for passengers. I waved my hand lazily, and after a few moments, one of the taxis pulled up to the curb. The driver, an older man, with a weathered face, nodded at me through the windshield. He didn't say anything, but the slight movement of his head was enough to signal I could get in. I opened the back door and climbed into the taxi. The leather seats creaked as I settled in, and the warmth inside was a welcome change from the wet, chilly air outside. The faint smell of old leather mixed with something more pungent, like stale coffee or old newspapers, but I didn't mind. I was tired, ready to be home and away from the outside world. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The car pulled away from the curb with a soft hum, the tires skimming over the wet pavement. The familiar sights of the city began to pass by, the familiar shops, the glowing neon lights, the shadowy alleyways. It was all routine, the same. Streets I always took to get home. But as we moved further down the street, something felt off. The buildings I passed seemed a little too tall, a little too dark. The streets felt too narrow, almost suffocating. The usual neon signs, the ones that I always saw and recognized, weren't there anymore. In their place were strange, unfamiliar signs, all in faded colors, their words too blurred for me to make out clearly. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking I was just tired, but the feeling only deepened. The streetlights, too, looked different. They weren't the usual warm glow I had grown accustomed to. Instead, they flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. It wasn't a strong enough light to guide the way. Instead, it created a sense of being lost, like the path was uncertain, like I was being led into a place I didn't recognize. I glanced at the driver through the rearview mirror. but his face was obscured by shadow. He hadn't spoken a word since I got in, and his silence was starting to feel uncomfortable. His eyes were hidden in the dark of the cab, and all I could see were the faint reflections of the streetlights on the glass. I started to feel the first stirrings of unease. I looked out of the window again, but the familiar streets weren't there anymore. The city was changing. The buildings that had once been landmarks, the streets I had walked 1,000 times before, were gone, replaced by unfamiliar structures, their windows dark and empty. There were no people on the streets anymore, no cars passing by. The world outside had fallen into a strange stillness, an eerie silence, like it was waiting for something. I was starting to feel trapped. My heart rate quickened as I watched the streets change around me, the scenery warping in subtle, unsettling ways. I turned to the driver, wanting to ask what was happening, to ask if he had noticed it too, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. I felt my throat tighten, like I couldn't breathe properly. The taxi continued to move, as though it were on an endless road that twisted and turned without direction. The rain against the window was now louder, more intense, though the sky outside remained dark and still. I tried to focus on something familiar, anything to ground myself, but every turn, every block, only took me further into the unknown. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out. I reached for the door handle, but the moment my hand touched the cold metal, a sense of dread washed over me. I pulled back, unsure why. It was just a door. But in that moment, I felt as though stepping out of the car would send me into a world I didn't belong to. I looked at the driver again, my heart pounding. He was still silent, his face hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something not right about this whole situation. Something in the air, something in the way the city had turned. It wasn't the city I knew anymore. It felt wrong. The taxi slowed to a stop, though I hadn't seen any sign of a destination. I looked out the window, but there was nothing familiar in sight. There were no landmarks, no street signs, just a dense, foggy mist that seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing up everything around me. I looked at the driver one last time. His face was still hidden, but now I could see his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It was as though he was bracing himself for something. Before I could speak, the door to the taxi opened on its own. I stepped out, instinctively, my legs shaky beneath me, and the moment my foot hit the pavement, I stopped. The world outside was not the city I knew. The streets were empty, the buildings towering above me, distorted and unfamiliar. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, like I was walking on sand, and I couldn't make sense of the space around me. The sky above was dark, no stars, no streetlights, just an oppressive thick blackness that stretched as far as I could see. I turned back toward the taxi, but it was gone. The street was empty now, and so was the road behind me. I was alone. I turned in every direction, but there was nothing but emptiness. I tried to walk, but the streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, never leading anywhere, I recognized. I felt the pressure in my chest tighten, panic rising inside me. The world outside felt unreal. I took a deep breath, my thoughts racing, and tried to calm myself. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe I had gotten out of the car in the wrong place. But nothing felt real. The street was wrong. The buildings were wrong. The air felt wrong. I reached for my phone, hoping to call someone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no connection to the world I knew. I started walking. I had to find something, someone. I had to find my way back. But no matter how far I walked, no matter how many streets I passed, the city didn't change. It was always the same, silent, empty, and completely wrong. The same dark fog hung in the air, the same quiet pressure in my chest. I felt like I was walking in a loop, like I was stuck in a place that wasn't real, a place I wasn't supposed to be. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the faint sound of the taxi. Its engine, distant but unmistakable, humming in the quiet night. The same taxi I had gotten into, but when I turned to look, there was no sign of it. The sound grew louder, closer, and that's when I realized I hadn't left the taxi at all. I never stepped out onto that street. It was never real. The driver, the city, the streets, they were all part of a place I couldn't escape from, a world I couldn't leave, and now I was trapped here, forever. It was just supposed to be a simple walk home. After a long day of meetings and phone calls, I needed the air, the silence between the noise of the office. I had no particular route in mind, just the usual stroll through the quieter streets, where the city noise dulled into the background, and the sound of my footsteps was the only company I had. The evening was calm, though a heavy fog had settled over the city, wrapping everything in a soft, cold embrace. The streetlights cast their orange glow over the wet pavement, reflecting on the sidewalks as if the world had turned into an abstract painting. I walked slowly, letting the quiet seep into me, my thoughts wandering, when I noticed her. She was standing in front of an old hotel. I didn't think much of it at first. The hotel was a familiar landmark in the area, a crumbling, faded building that had been there for as long as I could remember. I had passed it countless times, its brick walls weathered by time, its sign barely legible, as if trying to remember. A name that had long since faded from memory. I don't know why, but something about her caught my attention. She was just standing there, at the entrance, almost as if she were waiting for someone. Her figure was partially obscured by the fog, but I could make out her silhouette, tall with long dark hair, a long coat flowing gently in the breeze. She didn't move. She just stared at the entrance, her gaze fixed on the doors that I knew had been locked for years. There was something unsettling about how still she was, as if she were frozen in time. I walked a little closer, my feet moving, of their own accord, drawn by some strange instinct. The woman didn't acknowledge me, didn't move a muscle. I was close enough now to see her face. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her. But there was something in her expression, something that gave me a feeling of unease. Like she was waiting for me, like I was supposed to be there, standing in front of that hotel, at that exact moment. I shook off the feeling, dismissing it as a result of my tired mind. People often stood still in strange places, lost in thought, unaware of their It wasn't anything to be concerned about. But then I remembered something. The hotel had burned down years ago. I could picture it now. The headlines, the fire trucks, the news reports. It had happened while I was away on a business trip. I had returned to the city only to find the building in ruins, the charred remnants of what had once been a grand aging structure. The fire had claimed the building, and there had been no plans to rebuild it. For years now, that block had been empty, the site of the old hotel left abandoned. I stopped walking, my mind trying to reconcile the memory with what I was seeing in front of me. My feet felt heavy, as though the world around me had just shifted. I turned back to the hotel, staring at the same entrance, but now, in the quiet of the night, it felt different. Wrong. I knew the building hadn't been there. I knew it had been reduced to rubble, swept away by the fire. The sidewalk in front of it had been cordoned off for months, and then the site had just been left vacant, nothing but weeds and concrete foundations. Yet, standing before me was the hotel, standing tall and intact, as if it had never burned down. I turned to look at the woman again, but her eyes were still fixed on the entrance, never acknowledging my presence. She was standing perfectly still, as if she had been there for a long time, waiting for something. I swallowed hard, the weight of the situation slowly settling in my chest. This wasn't right. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes glued to the building, searching for something to explain what I was seeing. The windows were clean, the doors intact. The hotel looked almost new, as if it had been freshly restored. The old sign that had once hung above the door, faded and peeling, was now bright and clear. The name was legible, a faint glow from the lights above it. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the sign, the Oak Ridge Hotel. But that name, it didn't sit right. I knew the hotel had once been called something else, something long forgotten by most people. The Grand View, the Oak Ridge, was a name I hadn't heard in years, and I knew it wasn't the name of this building. It shouldn't have been the name of this building. I turned back to the woman, trying to calm the increasing panic rising in my chest. I was about to call out to her when she shifted. She finally moved, just slightly but enough to make my heart skip. She turned her head, slowly, almost too slowly, and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and for a moment, I saw nothing but an endless emptiness in them, a hollow void that made my skin crawl. And then she smiled. It was a thin smile, almost a smirk, but it wasn't one of warmth or friendliness. It was cold, calculating, as if she knew something I didn't. A quiet laugh bubbled up in her throat, barely audible, but the sound sent chills down my spine. She tilted her head slightly to the side, as though studying me, before her lips parted, just enough to speak. "You should go inside," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear in the still night. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The words didn't make sense. The hotel had burned down years ago. It didn't exist anymore. And yet, here I was, standing in front of it, the entrance open, and this woman, this stranger, telling me to go inside. "No," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "The hotel, it's been gone. It burned down." Before I could finish, she stepped aside, her hand sweeping toward the door of the hotel. She gestured with a slow, deliberate motion, as though inviting me in. Her smile never wavered, and that hollow emptiness in her eyes only deepened. "You've already been inside," she said, as if the words were an inevitability. I blinked, the weight of her words crashing down on me. What was she saying? I hadn't stepped inside. I had never even thought about entering. I turned to leave, but my feet felt heavy. My legs wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, like my body had been frozen in time. The woman's gaze was locked on me, her smile widening ever so slightly, and the world around me seemed to grow quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't hear anything. The city outside the park had faded into nothingness. The only sound was the quiet thrum of my own heartbeat. And then, without thinking, I stepped toward the door. I can't explain what happened next. The moment my hand touched the door handle, the world around me shifted. The street outside, the city, everything I had known, vanished. The morphed into an empty void, like I was in a place that didn't belong to time, a place where the past, present, and future collided. The hotel stood before me, but it was both the past and the present, the fire and the rebirth. I looked back, but the woman was gone, the street was gone, everything was gone, and all that remained was the Oak Ridge Hotel, standing proudly in the night, the door wide open. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in that moment. But when I finally stepped inside, I knew I wasn't meant to leave. Not anymore. I don't know what I walked into that night, but I've never found my way back. It was a regular Tuesday evening, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary happens but still feels draining in its own way. I had just finished work, my mind heavy with meetings and tasks left undone, and I decided to take my usual route home. It was a cool night, the kind where the air feels crisp but not too cold, and the streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting pools of yellow light on the damp pavement. I turned the corner of my street, a familiar road I had walked down countless times before. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the occasional hum of distant traffic breaking the silence. The buildings along the street were old, but well kept, the kind of apartments and row houses that had character but no pretension. I was lost in thought, my mind still trying to unwind from the stress of the day, when something caught my attention. A small sign near the corner, one I had never really noticed before. It was slightly weathered, the metal edges rusted, and the lettering faded. It read, Harrison Avenue. I paused for a moment, trying to process what I had just seen. I had walked this way 100 times, and I was almost certain the street was never called Harrison Avenue. I had lived in this neighborhood for years, long enough to know the names of every street and every alley. This had always been Eastbrook Street, at least as far as I could remember. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to remember if there had ever been a Harrison Avenue in this area, but nothing came to mind. I shrugged it off as a simple mistake, perhaps just a new street name that I hadn't noticed yet. Still, the oddity lingered in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I continued walking, telling myself it wasn't worth overthinking. I could hear the faint hum of a nearby cafe, the sound of conversations and the clinking of cups inside, but the street felt oddly deserted for a Tuesday evening. The houses I passed had their lights on, but there were no sounds of life coming from them. No televisions blaring, no dogs barking, not even the hum of a vacuum cleaner. I reached the next block, where the street would normally curve around to meet the next intersection. But this time, something was different. The sign had changed. Now it said, Harrison Avenue again. But it was the same block, the same stretch of sidewalk I had just walked, and I was sure that only a moment ago, the sign had read Eastbrook Street. I stopped, staring at the street name, trying to comprehend what was happening. It couldn't have been a coincidence. I was absolutely certain that I hadn't imagined it. I glanced up and down the street. The houses remained the same, familiar and unchanging. Yet, the name of the street had altered without warning. At this point, I started to feel an uncomfortable sensation creeping into my chest, like the world around me had shifted just slightly, and I was the only one who had noticed. A moment of disorientation settled over me, as if I was no longer fully in control of what I was experiencing. My thoughts were a swirl of confusion. I couldn't remember how much time had passed, but everything felt off. Was it possible that I had missed something? Maybe there had been a renaming of the street, some change that I hadn't paid attention to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. My feet continued to move forward, but my mind was struggling to catch up, to make sense of the dissonance. I kept walking, my pace quickening slightly, and soon I reached another intersection, the one that normally led to the bus stop where I would get off. But when I looked up, the street sign had changed once more. This time, it read Eastbrook Street again. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart beginning to race. My mind spun. How could this be happening? Just seconds ago, the street had been Harrison Avenue, and now it was back to Eastbrook Street. I looked around again, and everything seemed the same. The buildings, the sidewalks, the dim glow of the streetlights. But the street names had started to blur together. The feeling of unease grew, and I could hear the quiet rush of blood in my ears. I pulled out my phone, desperately searching for answers, trying to look up something about the neighborhood, about the street names, but the signal was gone. My phone's screen flashed with an error message. No signal. I tried again, but it didn't change. No Wi-Fi, no data. My phone had always worked in this area, but now it was as though the world had closed off from me. The air seemed thicker now, as if the world was pressing in on me, trapping me in this space. I wasn't even sure if I was moving in the right direction anymore. The streets didn't feel right. The names kept changing, flickering between two identities, and no one around me seemed to notice. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. No one was walking past, no cars driving by. The silence was deafening, and I felt like I was the only person left in the world. The shadows around me seemed darker, deeper. I felt like I was walking in a place that had no clear boundaries, where the rules of time and space were warped and distorted. I tried to keep moving, to find some way out of this loop. I turned left, then right, retracing my steps, but the street continued to stretch out before me, endlessly shifting in ways that made no sense. The signs changed again. Eastbrook Street, but this time the sign was different. It was faded, as though it had been there for years, neglected and weathered, as though it belonged to a past that didn't exist anymore. I felt my breath catch in my throat, panic rising like a wave. I turned again, my mind reeling, trying to find a way to escape this disorienting maze. But there was no escape. The street kept changing, the names kept shifting, and then, out of nowhere, I saw it, a shadow, a figure standing at the far end of the street, just beyond the corner. It was dark, indistinct, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't a person, not really. It was just a shape, a form that seemed to shift and move with the same unsettling fluidity as the street signs. It stood there, staring at me, unmoving. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it made me freeze. I felt a pull toward it, a magnetic force that drew me forward, despite my instincts screaming for me to turn and run in the opposite direction. But I couldn't move. My feet were planted to the ground. The figure remained still, its presence like a shadow in the corner of my mind. I took a slow step toward it, my breath shallow, my body trembling, and just as I did, the street changed, again. Eastbrook Street. But now, the sign was gone. The feeling of dread overwhelmed me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look away. I turned, my head spinning, and started walking back the way I had come, hoping for something familiar, hoping for anything that would break this maddening loop. But no matter how many steps I took, the street never looked the same. The name kept changing. The world around me felt increasingly unreal. The street stretched on forever, and I realized, with a growing sense of horror, that I might never find my way out. I had stepped into a place where time and space were fractured, where nothing could be trusted, and the rules of the world didn't apply. And every time I turned around, the street name would change again. It started like any other evening. I had just finished work and was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen. The usual end-of-day fatigue was setting in, a mix of relief and restlessness. The office was nearly empty, with just a few colleagues finishing up their tasks in the dimly lit cubicles. Outside, the last traces of sunlight were fading, and the rain had started up again, tapping softly against the windows. The familiar sounds of the city were muted, like a distant hum from a world I wasn't quite a part of at that moment. Didn't need to leave just yet. I didn't have anywhere important to go, no rush to get home. But I was tired of staring at my screen, so I decided to take a break. I stood up and walked toward the window, drawn to the view I had grown accustomed to, the same skyline I had seen every day for months. The city was always so vibrant, so alive, with lights reflecting off the wet streets, cars zooming by, people hustling through the rain with their umbrellas. It was chaotic in its own way, but it felt comforting to watch it all from up here. A quiet observer of the world below, but as I looked out, something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. The usual cityscape, the gleaming skyscrapers, the rows of buildings, all of it seemed distant, almost hazy. I squinted, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my eyes, but when I looked again, the fog wasn't just in my mind. It was outside the window, covering the city like a thick, suffocating veil. The lights that usually dotted the skyline were gone. The familiar street signs, the glowing billboards, the cars that were always moving, they were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the city was swallowed in an unnatural darkness, the kind of darkness that doesn't belong to night but to something else, something deeper. There was nothing but blank space outside the window. No signs of life, no movement, just an empty expanse stretching out endlessly in every direction. I took a step back, my pulse quickening as confusion began to creep in. I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the view to snap back into place. But when I opened them again, the city was still gone. I felt a coldness settle into my chest. There were no people below, no noise, no hum of the urban world that had always been there. It was as though the city had been erased, wiped from existence. The buildings were gone, the streets were gone, there was no sign of the bustling, living city I had known for so long. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around the office. The space felt off now, too. The walls, the furniture, the desk, everything seemed out of place, like it belonged to another time. The light in the room flickered faintly, casting shadows in the corners, and the silence felt too loud, too oppressive. It was as though the air itself had thickened, leaving me isolated in this strange, still world. I walked to the door, hoping that maybe I had just been imagining things, that if I left the office, I would find the city just as it always was. But when I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. No one else was there. The usual hum of voices. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridors. All of it was gone. The building was silent, the light overhead flickering like it was struggling to stay on. I walked toward the elevators, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loudly in the silence. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. But as the elevator descended, I noticed something else. The floors, the walls of the elevator, they were fading. The numbers above the door blinked, flickering with each passing second. The lights dimmed, and the sound of the elevator, which had once been a comforting hum, now felt hollow, as if I was descending into a place that didn't belong to reality. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal something that made my blood run cold. The lobby was gone. There was no reception desk, no chairs, no signs of life. The space in front of me was a hollow shell, empty and vast, stretching on endlessly. The floor was cracked, the walls were crumbling, and the air felt stale, as though the building had been abandoned for years. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs trembling, my head spinning. The hallway beyond was dark, stretching into shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I turned around, ready to go back to the elevator, but when I looked up, I realized that the elevator doors had vanished. The shaft was gone, the walls had dissolved into blackness. There was nothing behind me now but that endless, empty space. I backed away, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The silence was deafening. It felt like I had crossed into some other world, a world where time didn't exist, where the city had simply ceased to be. I couldn't explain it, but I knew in that moment that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I wasn't even sure if I was still in the same place. The world outside had vanished. My office, the building, the city, all of it had dissolved into nothingness. I stumbled backward, my eyes frantically searching for something, anything that would make sense of this. But there was nothing. The hallways stretched on, and every step I took only seemed to lead further into that void. I couldn't find the exit, couldn't find the stairs, couldn't find the street. I was trapped. I turned around again, hoping against hope that the city outside would somehow return, that the familiar lights, the noise, the people would be there. But when I looked out the window again, the emptiness stretched before me like a void that had no end. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark. Time didn't feel like it was moving in the same way. I didn't know if hours had passed or if I had only been standing there for minutes. But the city, the world, it was gone. And no matter how hard I tried, No matter how many times I tried to step back into it, I couldn't find my way out. I don't know if I'm still in the same place. I don't know if the city is still out there, somewhere beyond the dark. All I know is that the world I knew is gone, and I'm left here, in this empty, endless space, searching for something I can't even remember anymore. And every time I look out that window, the city isn't there. It never was. It was an ordinary Wednesday, or at least, it started that way. The kind of day where nothing in particular stands out. The same routine, the same walk to the bus, the same office desk that I sat at every morning. But as I stepped out from my usual lunch break, I felt a slight change in the air, a subtle tension I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the clouds gathering in the sky, or the sudden silence that seemed to weigh down the streets. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I was walking down the usual avenue, the one I always took, the one that led me toward the quieter side of town. As I passed a small cafe that I had walked by 100 times before, I noticed her, a woman standing just outside, holding a piece of paper in her hand. She wasn't dressed particularly strangely, but there was something in her posture that caught my attention. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes scanning the street, as if she were searching for something or someone. I slowed down a bit, unsure of why I was suddenly so focused on her. As I walked closer, she turned slightly, and our eyes met. She smiled, though it wasn't a smile I would call warm. It was a curious smile, the kind you give when you're unsure of something, when you're trying to make a decision. And then, without any warning, she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Can you tell me where the Aldenwood neighborhood is?" The words hit me like a jolt. I had been walking these streets for years, and I was certain I knew every part of town, I couldn't recall any neighborhood by that name, nor could I remember hearing it mentioned. I racked my brain, trying to picture a map of the city, but the name didn't fit anywhere. I must have hesitated too long, because she looked at me. Again, her eyes a little more expectant now. "Aldenwood," she repeated, glancing at the paper in her hand. "It's not far, is it?" I felt a little embarrassed, but I managed to shake my head. "I'm sorry, I don't think I've heard of it. Are you sure that's the right name?" She didn't seem perturbed by my confusion. In fact, she looked almost relieved, as if the answer she had been hoping for was finally confirmed. She nodded slowly, but her eyes never left mine. "It's just, I thought I was close," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "I was so sure I could find it here." There was a strange quiet between us then, the noise of the street around us fading, as if time itself had slowed down. I felt an odd, uncomfortable sensation rising in my chest. A creeping feeling that this moment was slipping into something I couldn't control. "Well, I can't say I know it," I finally said, trying to offer some reassurance. "I've lived here for a while, and I'm pretty sure there's no Aldenwood around here." Her smile faded, and she looked down at the paper in her hands, running her fingers along the edges. She stood there for a moment, as if processing something, before her eyes lifted again. "You must be mistaken," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "It's definitely here. I saw it on a map once. It's supposed to be." She trailed off, her gaze wandering down the street, like she was waiting for something to appear in front of her. I glanced down the street too. half expecting something to change, a sign to pop up, or a landmark to appear, but there was nothing. Just the usual stretch of pavement, the same familiar buildings that I had seen every day. Nothing had changed. I watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. She was still holding the piece of paper, now crumpling it slightly in her fingers. Her brow furrowed, a slight frown tugging at her lips. "I'll find it," she muttered, more determined now. She gave me one last look, a long stare, before she turned and walked briskly away, disappearing down the street, her footsteps fading into the noise of the city. I stood there for a while, feeling the weight of the conversation still lingering in the air. My mind couldn't stop turning over what she had said. Aldenwood. I had never heard of such a place. I tried to shake it off, but something about the encounter left a strange taste in my mouth. Like I had missed something important, like I had overlooked something that had been right in front of me. I finished my lunch break in a haze, my thoughts wandering, the image of the woman and her strange request gnawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to distract myself, to push it out of my thoughts, but it kept creeping back. When I returned to the office, I even found myself Googling Aldenwood neighborhood, but no results came up. Nothing. The day ended, and I walked back home, my feet heavy on the pavement. The evening had grown colder, the fog rolling in again, and the streets felt even quieter than usual. As I turned the corner onto my street, I found myself walking the same route I had just walked earlier. It was almost as though I was retracing my steps, though the scene around me hadn't changed. I found myself walking past the same buildings, the same streets, but this time I felt wrong. And then I saw it. A street sign. Not just any street sign, but one that I had never seen before. Aldenwood Drive. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. There, at the end of the block, the street sign stood tall, the words Aldenwood Drive etched clearly in the metal. I walked closer, my breath shallow, my mind trying to make sense of it. I had walked down this block countless times, and I was sure the sign had never been there before. I looked around, but nothing looked familiar. The houses, the buildings, they all seemed slightly off, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't quite my own. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't remember ever seeing that street sign, and yet, there it was, standing at the corner as though it had always been there. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling as I brushed against the metal. And the moment I did, the feeling of unease intensified. The world around me seemed to shift, the air growing thicker, more suffocating, the sounds of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the voices of people, it all started to fade, becoming muffled as though I was walking in a dream. Or maybe something worse. I turned back, feeling dizzy, but the street behind me had changed. The buildings weren't where they had been, and the street, though familiar, didn't look the same. The ground beneath me felt different, as though it was shifting with each step. I felt a sudden jolt of fear, and before I could make sense of anything, I ran. I ran down the block, my footsteps echoing in the empty street, the fog now swirling around me, the world becoming harder to see. The farther I ran, the less I recognized, and the street behind me, Aldenwood Drive, seemed to stretch and twist, like it was leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. I stopped, breathless, looking around, but everything felt out of place. There was no sign of the woman anymore, no trace of where she had gone, just the street, and the name. I couldn't shake it. I didn't know how long I stood there, caught in the confusion of it all, but when I finally looked back, the sign was gone. There was only the street, empty, silent, and I still couldn't explain what had happened. But somewhere, deep inside, I knew that the neighborhood never existed at all, and I had just stumbled into it. It was a typical Thursday, the kind of day that floats by unnoticed. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden hue over the city. The streets were starting to empty, the usual rush of people retreating to their homes, but the evening was still alive with energy. I had just finished my work for the day, feeling the exhaustion set in, but content enough to walk home. I'd decided to take the bridge, the one that cuts across the river and leads to my neighborhood. It was a small detour, but one I had grown fond of over the years. The view of the city, the water below, the reflection of the sunset on the buildings. It was always calming, a peaceful way to end the day. As I walked toward the bridge, I noticed the usual hum of the city fading. The streets were quieter than normal, but it wasn't unusual for a Thursday evening. There was a cool breeze in the air, the kind that hints at the coming of fall. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, ready to cross the bridge and head home. The bridge was old but sturdy, the kind with high stone walls on either side. The ones that have weathered decades of use, their surfaces smoothed by countless hands. It was a bridge that had always been part of the landscape, part of my daily life. But tonight, as I stepped onto it, there was something different. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally you could hear the city around you, the cars, the distant sounds of voices, the occasional honking of a horn. But tonight there was nothing, not a single sound. It was like the world had simply gone mute. Even the water below, which usually rippled and whispered against the stones, was still. The only sound was the echo of my own footsteps, soft and muffled against the stone. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was simply tired, that I had walked this path too many times to feel uneasy. But something about the bridge tonight felt off. The air seemed heavier, thicker, and the sky above felt too still, as though it was holding its breath. As I reached the middle of the bridge, I glanced down at the river below. It was dark, the water reflecting the dim light of the city, but there was something strange in the reflection. The buildings I had passed on my way here, the familiar skyline of the city, were gone. Instead, I saw a different city, one I didn't recognize. Tall, sleek skyscrapers with smooth glass surfaces, their lights blinking in patterns I had never seen before. The river seemed to reflect this new city, and it didn't make sense. The skyline wasn't mine. It wasn't the city I knew. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine, my heart rate picking up. I blinked, looked again, but the city in the water hadn't changed. The buildings were the same, the skyline unfamiliar. I stepped back, unsure whether I had simply misjudged my surroundings. But when I turned to face the bridge again, my confusion deepened. The path ahead seemed different now. The bridge, which had always stretched into the city I recognized, now led somewhere else, somewhere that didn't fit, like I had crossed into a space that wasn't mine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This was just some trick of the mind, I thought. Perhaps the fading light was distorting my perception of the city around me. I continued walking, trying to push away the gnawing feeling that had taken root in my chest. But with each step I took, the city ahead seemed to shift more, becoming less familiar. The buildings ahead of me weren't the ones I knew. The streets, the lights, even the way the shadows fell seemed wrong. I stepped off the bridge, onto the path that should have led me back to my street. But the road looked different now. The houses that should have been there were replaced with sleek, modern buildings, all glass and steel, with no sign of the small homes I had grown up with. The streetlights, usually warm and yellow, were replaced with bright, cold lights that flickered, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I felt my pulse quicken as I walked deeper into the unfamiliar city. The streets were empty, eerily so, and everything looked too clean, too perfect. The roads were wider than I remembered, and the buildings seemed to stretch on forever, rising high into the air. The windows were all dark, and not a single soul seemed to walk the streets. The air felt heavier here, colder. It was as if this city was frozen in time, waiting for something, or maybe waiting for me. I looked around hoping to see something, anything that might bring me back to the city I knew. I turned a corner, expecting to see something familiar. Maybe a sign, a landmark, but instead, the streets twisted into unfamiliar alleyways. The city I had known was gone, replaced by a strange, cold version of itself. The buildings towered over me, their reflective surfaces gleaming in the dark, and I felt small, swallowed up by a place that didn't belong to me. I tried to retrace my steps, to find the bridge, to find something that would bring me back to where I had been. But no matter which direction I took, the streets stretched on, the city expanding in ways that didn't make sense. The skyline that had reflected in the river was now all around me. The familiar city I had known replaced with something foreign. I pulled out my phone, hoping to find a way to navigate, but when I looked at the map, it was blank. No signal. No streets. Just empty space where the map should have been. I checked the time. It was the same as it had been when I started my walk, but nothing else made sense. The streets, the buildings, even the air around me, it all felt wrong. It felt like I had stepped into a place that didn't exist, a city that wasn't mine, a world that wasn't meant for me. The longer I stood there, the more the feeling settled in my chest. The feeling that I was lost in a place that had never been real, that I had crossed into a world that wasn't mine. And with each step I took, the more I realized that there was no way back. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge I had crossed hadn't just taken me from one side of the river to the other. It had taken me somewhere else entirely, somewhere I was never supposed to be. A city that wasn't mine, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, I was trapped in a place that wasn't meant for me.